The landing site the Americans chose was through the mountains out in the flat remote desert beyond, 10 miles from habitation. But across it runs a road upon which perhaps a dozen vehicles pass each hour. We travelled, as did the only Iranian witnesses to what happened last Thursday night, by bus. 2 or 3 buses a day run the 14 hours from Tabas to Yazd. The Americans seem not to have anticipated that one would pass whilst they were here. The passengers arrived before the rescue attempt burst into flames. They were ordered from their bus around 9:30 in the evening and were then to observe at close quarters what the world has argued about ever since.
All right, here's an overview of what we're going to talk about. I just want to give you a quick background of why Operation Eagle Claw came, give you the mission statement, talk a little bit about the planning and training challenges. We'll cover the air players a little bit. We won't cover all the air players that were involved in the planning. We'll go through the plan, and then I'm going to pass the sticks over to the chief, and he's going to talk about execution. And then if we have time, we'll go through conclusions and lessons learned. All right, for those who weren't born in 1979, the Iranian Revolution took place starting in February of '79. And the Shah, Mohammad Pahlavi, was overthrown. He ended up going into exile in the United States and went into medical treatment for cancer. But from February of '79 until November of '79, the Iranians had been trying to get him extradited back to Iran for trial against, for crimes against his people. And the U.S. refused to bring him back. So because of the perceived compliance with the Shah's actions, they invaded our embassy.
The special report that we planned to bring you tonight was about domestic politics, the battle among the Democrats. But we think the crisis in Iran is more urgent right now than the campaign here at home. Some 60 Americans, including our fellow citizen whom you just saw bound and blindfolded, are now beginning their 6th day of captivity inside the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. It's Friday morning there now. But throughout this night in Washington, officials will continue their search for some way to negotiate the hostages' freedom. That search was not successful today. In this broadcast, we'll have reports on the diplomatic efforts to resolve the problem and on other aspects of the crisis as well. But we begin now with an on-the-scene account by the one American television correspondent who has been there since the beginning, the seizure of the embassy last Sunday, and who, with his crew, has provided us with outstanding coverage all this week. Here is Bob Dyke in Tehran.
This picture tells it all. This flag was apparently taken from someone's office inside the United States Embassy. It was burned Tuesday evening outside the embassy's gates. To the Iranian demonstrators who set fire to it, this was a symbol of victory. 2 days earlier, several hundred young people, mainly students at Tehran University, had taken over the embassy. We are not occupiers, they said. We have thrown out the occupiers. But instead of chasing all the Americans out of the compound, the Iranians imprisoned them in a building somewhere on these grounds. They have been hostages ever since.
Literally 3,000 Iranian students came into the U.S. Embassy and overran the small Marine security force, took 52 diplomats, citizens, and military personnel hostage, and ultimately held them for 444 days. To that end, planning began almost immediately for a rescue mission. And there's the mission statement here. Develop the capability for a rapid clandestine insertion into Tehran, a surprise entry of the embassy with as little violence and loss of life as possible on either side, and rapid exfiltration of the hostages and rescue force. Planning actually took place, or started to take place, 3 days after the takeover of the embassy. Here's some of the planning and training challenges. First of all, Tehran is, as you know, way the hell in there in Iran. We didn't have a lot of friendly neighbors around Iran which to start a rescue mission. Initially, they talked about taking trucks into Turkey, but that seemed to be too risky, and there was going to be too much loss of life, particularly with civilian casualties. OPSEC was a critical factor from the start, and came to be a little bit of an Achilles heel because of that. If the Iranians found out what we had been planning, they would have dispersed the hostages possibly to various locations, making rescue improbable or impossible. To that end, OPSEC was handled very, very well. Almost no one knew of the plan or the execution until after the fact. So the OPSEC was good, but it also highlighted some problems, particularly in the training arena, where the services oftentimes trained separately from each other. The ground forces almost never trained with the air and marine helicopter forces in large exercises. The aircraft trained in various locations, Guam, Hurlburt Field, Florida, or down in Florida, in the Western Desert, the Marines trained in the Western Desert, and the like. And we'll talk more about pockets of excellence and the stovepiping that took place in the training. Other problems highlighted in hindsight were weather, the reliability of the helicopters, comms, refueling procedures, security control, and intelligence. A large part of the intelligence was stovepiping, not so much from the intelligence personnel keeping information away from the operators, but from the planners keeping the operation a secret from their supporting intelligence personnel and intelligence community liaisons. And then as training began and planning began in November, and several iterations of exercises took place, it started to become apparent that it had to happen sooner rather than later, because after 1 May, the hours of darkness was going to shrink to 9 hours and 60 minutes, and the helicopters needed 8 hours of darkness to operate the first day, or the D-1 part of the mission, with an hour of slop time. That's 9 hours. And then ambient temperatures of greater than 30 degrees centigrade was also going to become a factor with regards to keeping the aircraft aloft, particularly the rotary wing aircraft. These are the players, the air players that were selected, and some of the reasons why. The Marine Corps had taken command of the RH-53D Sea Stallions from the Navy in the early 70s. Having said that, the Marine crews were going to launch off of the USS Nimitz, a Navy aircraft carrier. Some of the pros to having these aircraft or these helicopters selected was the airlift capability. They could carry certainly more, particularly if they went with less fuel, about 42,000 pounds, or upwards of 50 people if they needed to. Range was a big factor. If you look at the picture on the bottom left, see those tanks on the outside sides of the helicopter. Those are sponson tanks full of fuel, which gave the Sea Stallion an incredible amount of range compared to its H-53 counterparts. And then it had a collapsible main rotor. If you look on the picture to the right, you can see the main rotor blades all folded up together, so you can fit them nicely on the deck of a carrier or the deck of a BOAT somewhere. And other aircraft types, such as the Air Force HH-53, didn't have that installed at the time. Other alternatives that they considered was the CH-46, the CH-47, and the CH-53, the Navy of the 53. But for various reasons that I just mentioned, the pros, the RH-53 was selected. Another thing that the RH-53 did from an OPSEC perspective was it wasn't a big deal to see Marine helicopters board or on the deck of a carrier doing minesweeping operations, which was what they were meant for. Whereas if you put Air Force or Army helicopters on the deck, that might have been an OPSEC trigger. Again, Chief, if I'm faster, you want to add something, please chime in.
You're doing good.
The MC-130 Combat Talon 1, call sign wagon 1 through 3. There were actually 4 Talon 1s in the option. One of them was a spare. These were Air Force aircraft, Air Force crews. The Talon came to be from the Vietnam era, and it had a number of avionics upgrades and features that allowed it to do low-level threat penetration. I think they did modify terrain following because they didn't need to. They wanted to conserve fuel and they didn't need to defeat enemy radars as low as that. And then have blacked out takeoff and landing capabilities with NVG trained crews and NVG compatible cockpits. One of the cons of the MC-130 is it has 1 less pallet position than the standard Slick C-130 because you have 2 extra crew members, an electronic warfare officer and a radio operator, and those positions took up the frontmost pallet position of the crew compartment, or of the cargo compartment. Right. Chief, you want to add anything to this?
The other thing, the combat Talons were specially modified with in-flight refueling, and that was a key to mission success. We had to fly in considerable distance, maintain on the ground for a long period of time, and then fly out. And in-flight refueling was imperative. And we had 135s that were in the Iranian Sea. They're off of Oman, waiting to refuel us. Hence, the Talons were selected because of an interesting time.
To that end, another C-130 variant that had air-to-air refueling capability from KC-135s was the ABCCC, or the EC-130 Hercules. And so 3 of the EC-130s out of the Airborne Command and Control unit in Mississippi, 3 platforms were selected to become essentially flying fuel tanks to be able to get to the Desert One site and do forward area rearming and refueling, or ground refueling of the helicopters halfway up Iran, as the helicopters were going to fly from the Gulf of Oman, eventually into Tehran.
Hey, Brian,
the
criminal.
Yeah.
Hey, it's Rich. I was just going to ask, why did they choose EC-130Es?
I can answer that question.
All right.
The only C-130s in the whole United States Air Force that were in-flight refueling capable was 6 Talon 1s, MC-130 Echoes, 5 EC-130 ABCCC birds, and 8 AC-130 gunships. The in-flight refueling capability was just coming on and being modified on airplanes. So we had to pick the airplanes that had in-flight refueling. Most of the PACAP birds in the first SOS, all 4 of them had in-flight refueling. The 8th SOS, where I was, our initial birds, we only had 2, and as we trained for 6 months, the rest got modified. But the EC-130s, we went to Keesler and stole those boys because they fit our mission that we needed, i.e., we took the capsule out so it had a full C-130 cargo compartment, and we put dual rails in so you could haul cargo, and that's how we loaded the bladder platforms into them. We put 2 bladders in them, so they carried right at 60,000 pounds of gas in the bladders, and they had the capability. Now, those airplanes were flown by combat Talon crews, and they were flown on the wing of a Talon 1, just like the concept during Vietnam on the Raid on Sante. A Talon led in the 8 C-130s because of its terrain following capability.
Thanks, Chief. Great gouge.
And then one of the other factors flying paired up with combat Talons was the lack of the sophisticated navigation and terrain following equipment that you had in the Talon 1. But the the EC-130s had the sufficient pumps and hoses and filter assemblies to become flying fuel tanks.
Yeah, we stole
Awesome.
All
Thanks,
right.
man.
Okay. The plan was complicated. And so there are a lot of words. I'm just going to have you read the slides, but I want you to understand just how complex the plan was. So D-1, this is the day before we're taking down the embassy to rescue hostages. 6 C-130s, we just mentioned, 3 combat Talon 1s and 3 EC-130s flying in. 132 ground personnel, including Delta Force with Colonel Beckwith, Army Ranger security team, support personnel, translators, combat controllers, and then the EC-130s with helicopter fuel in bladders all leave Masira Island off the coast of Oman and fly 1,000 miles to Desert 1. 8 Navy Sea Stallions lift off from the Nimitz just south of the Iranian coast and fly 600 miles. Helicopters are going to ground refuel with the EC-130s. The ground assault forces on the Talon 1s are going to transload over to the helicopters, and the helicopters are going to fly onto Desert 2, which is a hideout southeast of Tehran. The C-130 fleet's going to go back to Oman after refueling on the way home and reconfigure themselves for the following day's mission. And then the helicopters, after dropping the ground crew, they're going to go to a third site and hide out at the third site away from the ground forces. On D-Day, and we're talking about the fact that it's these are 2 nights, not an actual day, Delta Force is going to be driven to the U.S. Embassy in vehicles CIA agents who are in country have acquired, quote unquote, acquired, to take them into the embassy compound. The C-130s are going to fly into Iran again with a company of Army Rangers to do an airfield seizure and takedown of an abandoned airfield called Mansouriya, about 50 miles south of Tehran. Detachment A, Fred Maxwell will like this. Detachment A was a SOC-year or a soft element in EUCOM, rather, in Berlin specifically, and they had the ability to infill covertly into Iran, and they were going to rescue American hostages held at the Foreign Ministry building. And then everyone was going to converge at a football stadium nearby and call in the helicopters who were hiding out before. 3 Air Force AC-130s who were in Egypt were going to be used to provide top cover for the Rangers over Mansouriya and then support Delta's assault. They were also fragged with killing or destroying rather the 3 fighter aircraft at Tehran Air Base. And then they were going to monitor Mehrad Air Base to make sure that the Iranian Air Force didn't start doing anything. Helicopters would go from the soccer pitch to Mansouriya, and Air Force C-141s controlled with an AWACS was going to fly in from Egypt, land at Mansouriya, take everybody. The Rangers are going to blow up the helicopters, and all the fixed-wing aircraft are getting out of there with all the people. It's kind of a graphic of what that's supposed to look like, give you an idea where these places were. Masira all the way down at the bottom of the graph, flying all the way up through the Gulf of Oman, and slicing into Iran. Helicopters leaving the Nimitz, the Coral Sea was out there as well. 8 helicopters left the Nimitz to try and make it to Desert 1. And then the helicopters were going to continue on from Desert 1 to Desert 2 near Tehran. And then you see the gold line, or the gray line rather, of the other forces flying from Egypt to do the Ranger airfield assault. For those who like 1980s graphics, here's 1980s graphic that more or less shows the same thing with a little bit more fidelity on where the aircraft were. For those who are graphic learners, this is Iran. North is up. The blue triangle is roughly where Desert 1 was located. It was located between Yazd and a little town called Tabas. It's 58 nautical miles southwest of Tabas, right smack in the middle of the desert. Here's the proof. It's right smack in the middle of the Kavir Desert. That's the Desert 1 site. Again, the blue triangle. This gives you an idea of why the routing was the way it was for both the fixed wing and the rotary wing assets flying up into Desert 1. And then this is old school imagery. This is actually the Desert 1 type imagery. That line cutting through that looks like a lightning bolt is the road between Yazd and Tabas. And we can talk about how prudent it is to have a thoroughfare through your covert LZ in a little bit. All right, I'm going to pass it over to Taco and have him talk about the remainder of this, or at least through the Desert 1 execution.
Thank you, Brian. And I want to thank you guys all for your service and what you guys do. You know, it's been a long time. I retired in 2001, but I still bleed blue and special ops all the time. Tomorrow will be 40 years of that night, and I remember it just like it was yesterday. You know, it was a mission that, for a little background for you so you understand, is that at the time the hostages were taken in Iran, the soft community, they were downsizing us. All the gunships were slated to go to the Guard. The combat Talon 1s were going to be retired because post-Vietnam, U.S. Congress and stuff didn't like special ops. They hated us because we were too sneaky and they didn't trust us. They had downsized half of the Special Forces battalions and literally almost destroyed the whole SEALs. So when the Iranians took the hostages, all of a sudden they called down and said, "Hi, help, can you guys go do this?" Because, you know, we were still designated as special ops. And, you know, as our motto says, here we are, send us. Or here I am, send me. We said, okay, we'll figure it out. The airplanes were in disarray. There were no such thing as NVGs back then. Matter of fact, the flight testing of it 2 years earlier said they were unsafe to fly with and should never be flown with. There were no capabilities of landing in the dark. There was no capabilities of in-flight refueling in blacked out environments. And there was no capability to land in the dark. It just was. We started from square one. And I can tell you, those square ones were an interesting 6 months of flying. We flew pretty much every day with maybe a couple of days break a week from November to April the 24th of 1980. The average 8th SOS crews, there was 6 of us, but the first 3 that have been there since day one, which I was on lead in Chalk 1, we averaged 1,100 flying hours in less than 6 months. You think about that, about a time in the air, we was some tired puppies. But it was kind of like the Wild Wild West. We were able to modify airplanes. We didn't like something. We drill holes in the bottom of the floor of the airplane, add something to it. We'd bolt stuff out on the landing lights and taxi lights. Maintenance had nightmares. It took the Air Force 10 years after the raid was over to get all the Talon 1s configured the same way because of how everybody did what they needed to do. So if you take that in perspective, you know, we never knew if we were going to go tomorrow, next week, next year. It just kept dragging out, and then all of a sudden in April, you know, we were shocked that Jimmy Carter said, do it. So then we ended up briefing for the mission. Jimmy Carter said it's a go. So we took off that night into that desert landing strip. Now, a couple of knowns that we were briefed. One of the things that bothered me then and even later in my military career was because we were so discombobulated as services. You know, everybody had their own intel. Everybody had their own weather people, and heaven forbid they ever talk to each other. Army range. I mean, the 53s were briefed on weather and stuff, which created a lot of issues for us that night in the desert. As you see in this night one landing option, that's the configuration with all the airplanes on the ground. And you notice there's 8 helicopters there. That's what was the plan was for. We had 3 refueling birds, 2 birds, Chalk 1 and Chalk 2, primarily had Delta Force and the Rangers on them. Chalk 3 had cargo netting and another 500-gallon bladder to be used as backup fuel. That roadway, you see the 4 little dots on either side and then the 1 dot at the end. It was designed because our tactics, we learned how to land on what's called a box and 1. The 1 is a strobe at the end. Now that's the way that landing strip was supposed to have been set up. But when Colonel Carney went in about a month before with the CIA to put some lights in the ground with pop-up sensors, that airplane I was on, we had the remote control for it to have them pop out of the sand and land on them. Well, if you see where the curve is just past that box and 1, that on the south side, that box of 4 were actually set up right in the middle of the curve. So we ended up doing 3 low passes before we could determine what really was the heading of the box versus the strobe. Just before we landed, there was a huge haboob came through and put about 12 inches of loose sand on top of the desert landing floor. So, yeah, it was an adventure to say the least. You get the next slide, Brian. The helicopters, that was their staggered formation coming off of the ships. An interesting thing about the helicopters that's least talked about is those helicopters were put on the Nimitz in December of '79. They were never flown until the night of the assault. They were brought up at nighttime, couple, 2-3 times a week, put back together and run up, but they never flew. Well, from the old school, 53 is a high maintenance helicopter. And if you don't fly it, it's going to break. And that was one of Beckwith's biggest worries was, were we going to have the right number of helicopters to get there? The mission called for a minimum of 6. So, mission commander, General Watt, added a 7th one, and then Jimmy Carter added an 8th one. So we had 8, figuring we're bound to get 6 if we had 8. When the helicopters were on the Nimitz, to save weight because of desert altitude and stuff flying, they wanted to save weight. They took the EEPs off of the engines of those 53s. The EEPs are called electronic particle separators that keep the dust out of the engines. Well, here we are in the desert with dust. And now you understand some of the reasons why the helicopters aborted because of dust and stuff. Next slide. You see where those Dash 6 went down, Dash 5, Dash 2. You know, they one had a BIM light, which is Dash 6, and its problem is that it's saying the blade's coming apart. You don't want to go nowhere with that one. Dash 5 ended up, you see those two little, like, little fuzzy things? Those were the actual sandstorms they flew through. Those early warning radars there on the coast, we knew they weren't active. They did not. So they flew in at 100 foot. The CIA was only involved in the part up at the high side. They were not all in this part of the operation. They would have been fully up in night 2 and from the high side where the helicopters were. So when we flew in at 5,000 foot above it. When they flew in at 100 foot, 200 foot, which created problems. At one point, next slide. Slide. Okay, if you see this helicopter formation, it was quite interesting. The one on the left there, Chalk 1 and 2, they were in the sand so long they got tired. They said, oh, this is too bad. We got to go back. So they turned back. So you got 3, 4, 5, 7, and 8 still going. Well, then Chalk 3 gets up there and says, hey, we're somewhat okay. So Chalk 1 and 2 turn around and start back. Chalk 7 had turned around and turned back around. Chalk 5 turned around and returned right back to the ship. Then Chalk 8 was coming out a little later. If you see where those helicopters are at in the one on the right, how in the hell they didn't run into each other, I have no clue. I mean, they were in 0-0 viz, not talking to each other. They didn't even have the capability of flashing lights out of the gunner windows because it was so dusty. But they just kept on. I mean, they're very, very lucky they did not blow up all 8 of them en route to the desert. Next slide. This is kind of how it was supposed to be on the ground in the refueling points. That's how it ended up being. Okay? You had 3 on one, 1 on the other, and 2 on the others. But it was supposed to be 3, 3, and 2. And then the bladderbird. Next slide.
The helicopters appear to have landed first. 6 of them, no evidence of more. Beside each, a telltale stack of empty cans revealed that their occupants had had time for a meal. Inside the belly of one helicopter that remained intact, guns, bullets, first aid, camouflage, radio equipment. Outside, refueling pumps, but no sign of lights to guide other craft down. After the helicopters had landed, but before the inferno, a tanker moved towards the landing site. We met its driver, who we found inspecting what had been his vehicle. He explained he'd been driving when he heard a gunshot, felt the bullet hit his tanker. Then something hit his front wheels and he stopped. Then he saw 2 men in combat jackets, Americans, on their bellies moving with guns. A bullet shattered his windscreen, the glass cutting him about the eye, He jumped from the tanker as it burst into flames. It appears he had met an American outpost several hundred yards from the landing site. They'd sought to use his flaming truck as a roadblock to discourage other traffic. He then ran away, never saw flames in the distance, and put the time at 10:30 last Thursday night.
Now here's the fun part. All the combat Talon 1s were TFR capable, Larry. We could have been down there, but why fly in the dust if you ain't got to? All right, you see this? Now I got to tell you the story of this real time so you understand it. Because I was there, I got that t-shirt. When we went in and we did the go-arounds and stuff. Now remember, if you look at those first slides up there, this is a covert clandestine mission. And meaning that we were supposed to get in and get out without nobody knowing we were there so that we could prosecute Night 2. Excuse me. Well, we were briefed by Intel, God love Intel, that road was a very less traveled road. All you could ever have is maybe some banditos every once in a while, but really nothing on that road. Okay. So we come into land. Now, I'm the loadmaster on the lead airplane at the ramp hinge. And the way we did a rapid offload was, as soon as we hit the ground, the ramp door was coming open, and I'm hanging out the back of the airplane to lower the ramps down so we can get on my airplane, I had a Ranger Jeep, an M151A1 Jeep, 2 motorcycles, I had 5 Rangers, and then 90-some Delta in my airplane. It's a heavy airplane. The C-130 is designed to take off at 175,000 pounds max gross weight. When we took off out of Oman, we weighed 196.5. When we landed in the desert, we weighed 186. Yeah, we kind of broke that airplane. So if we land, open up the ramp door, and the MBGs back then were PBS-5s, which means they're very susceptible to light, and you had full face. You couldn't see out around them. So I'm standing on the back, we're got the ramp at level, and all of a sudden, these lights, and the airplane was actually turned around the other way with the tail facing the way the bus was coming. We turned around after that. So all of a sudden, these lights were behind me. So I turn around and look, and I see these headlights coming. Now, I'm staring down the barrel of the 50 cal machine gun on the Jeep, and Rangers on the ramp with me. And then all of a sudden, somebody yelled something in the cargo compartment, and then they started shooting at this vehicle. Now, I'm between them and the vehicle. I'm not a happy camper. We finally get them stopped and offload. They go chasing after this vehicle. Now, understand, you're in the middle of the desert, and it's batshit dark out there, but you can see that these lights are pretty interesting. So it happens to be a bus. I'm going, damn, we got a bus in the middle of the damn desert. They come running back. There's 44 people on board. And then so we started going in the process of what we're going to do with these 44 people. We can't leave them here. So we were going to end up taking them out on my airplane to bring them back in the next night. We would have they ended up in another place in Iran than they were. Now remember, we don't take hostages as Americans. They were just going to be detainees. That was the brief. So, I'm like, okay, this is a whole lot of fun. One time it crossed through my mind that it was a crew bus going to take us to the hotel, but obviously it wasn't a crew bus. So they shot at it and finally got on the bus, and everybody in there was an Iranian family that this rich Iranian takes his family down on their vacation every year, and they go via this way. Especially me, they had an adventure of a lifetime. We're dealing with that, and the blocking position. One, the end where you see the blowed up vehicle is supposed to be where 2 motorcycles were going to be at, and then the other one was going to be the gun jeep. And they were out purposely to block for any traffic or anything coming down, or be able to neutralize it if need be for the mission to continue. So we're standing out behind the airplane. I got Colonel Kyle, Colonel Beckwith, bunch of Rangers, the Rangers, Delta, Bucky Burris, all of them going, what are we going to do with these people? I say, we just put them in the damn airplane. We'll take them, we'll get them back. And then while we're talking about that, TFR's terrain following radar. Next thing we know, here's a set of lights coming down the road again. We're like, what the hell? This Grand Central Station or what? So Colonel Beckwith tells Wade Ishimoto, who was the Delta Intel guy, who was in charge of the blocking positions, to stop that vehicle. I love Wade to death. He pulls out his .45 and shoots at this vehicle. Well, he emptied the clip, but it didn't stop. So we told the Ranger on the motorcycle to stop the vehicle. So the Ranger got off of his motorcycle, pulled a light attack rocket out of his pack, loaded it up, and launched it. And needless to say, blew the truck up. And oh, by the way, it happened to be a fuel truck. So, massive explosion. The truck driver gets out and runs back behind the truck. And there's another truck behind him that had been running lights out. And that was pretty much what we figured was all said and done was the banditos that were, running fuel to the south. Because they turned around and took off, never to be seen again. And it was kind of thought at that time that they thought they had to come to meet Jesus meeting with Allah in the middle of the desert. So they really didn't have nothing to say to anybody at that point in time. So that's kind of how, and that all happened within the first 5 minutes of being on the ground. Now, remember I told you, this is a clandestine covert operation here. I'm like, holy hell, what else could happen? Next slide. So now everybody else gets on the ground. They had to land over that burning truck, which destroyed the MBG. So it was a circle rope getting all of the airplanes in when it was all set up. Everybody got on the ground fine. Waited another couple hours for the helicopters who were late. They got there, and after they got there, my airplane stayed for about another 30 minutes until we were bingo fuel. We had been airborne probably 15 minutes when the crash happened, heading back to Oman, and we had no radio communication, so we didn't realize what happened until we actually got back on the ground in Oman. But knowing the story very, very well, what happened was it was determined that Chalk 2 had a secondary hydraulic problem and could no longer fly. Well, if you count those helicopters there's 6, and if you take 2 out, there's 5. Remember, the minimum was 6. So it was decided that close everything up, come back to do it another day, just blow the helicopter up there, and we'd be all good. Now, understand those 3 tanker birds and how close they are. Inside of those tanker birds, you had 2 20,000-gallon bladders that were empty, which means you got a lot of fuel fumes. Helicopters all had full loads in them. And remember that 12 inches of sand I told you about? Yeah, well, when a helicopter lifts up, they brown out when you got that much dust. And basically what happened is Chalk 3, when he lifted off, he thought he was going straight up, but instead he was going forward. Now the distance from the end of that tail of that 130 to the rotor disc end of that 53 was 32 feet. Of the length of the fueling hoses we were using. So he slid forward the rotor disc hit the vertical stabilizer and launched that helicopter between number 1 and 2 engines, at which time it exploded and blew into the front of the C-130.
The crash happened later. It was to result in the devastation of one of the massive transport planes and one of the helicopters. This is the core of the tragedy. First impressions might suggest that this is simply the wreckage of the giant C-130 transport plane. But this is the entire rotor assembly of one of the American helicopters that were involved in the rescue attempt. It was parked over here, and it was when it took off on a mistaken bearing that it sliced into the Hercules plane. That, at least, is the version that has flowed from America in the past few days. But a combination of factors that we found suggested the possibility that the Hercules had in fact ploughed into the helicopter. The ruts left behind in the aftermath of landing appear to have swerved to miss another helicopter. The reverse thrust of the plane's huge propellers blowing sand forward around the cockpit in pitch darkness may have persuaded the pilot that he'd passed the last helicopter. The propellers on the impact side are in smithereens, as if they hit something static whilst still in motion. Yet the helicopter blades are practically intact, suggesting they were not rotating. The molten aluminium marked the intense heat of the blaze which followed, so intense that no American could get near to drag clear the bodies in the wreckage. The strong implication that this plane had brought the helicopter's lifeblood, without which now the mission was doomed: the fuel. 100 yards away, the only other tracks left by a plane, those of another Hercules, the plane by which the Americans were now to escape. There was no sign that any other craft landed. Only 2 planes and 6 helicopters here then. So what happened to the others? Did they land elsewhere? Amid frantic moves to leave, the Americans splashed jet fuel on their grounded craft. They fired into some of them. 3 caught fire and were totally destroyed. 2 survived. 1 was even started by the Iranians themselves late last night. The bus people they let go. These terrified country folk fled the blaze, their worldly possessions left in a heap beyond the carnage. And the Americans, crammed desperately into the belly of one surviving plane, lifted off, comforting 4 desperately burnt compatriots, abandoning a scene of utter hopelessness, and leaving behind any chance of rescuing 50 hostages held 400 miles beyond these desert wastes. John Snow,
So you see
News
what
at
you
10
got on the ground
at the
there.
American
Pretty
crash
interesting,
site
didn't it?
in Iran.
So when it blew up, inside of that 130 at the time of that explosion was 6 people on the flight deck, 3 pilots, 2 navigators, and a flight engineer. One of the pilots, Jeffrey B. Harrison, survived because he was blown down in the where the front crew entrance stairs are at. In the back of that airplane was between the 3 loadmasters, the radar operator, the EWO. No, not EWO. The EWO wasn't on that. Radio operator. And there was 78. The rest were Delta. That airplane was closed up. It became an inferno. If it wasn't for the great heroism of the loadmasters on there, Kenny Bancroft Spoon, Jimmy McLean, God rest his soul, and the Delta guys, the loss would have been horrific. We would have lost over 80-some people in just that one airplane. And Chalk 6, Jerry Utero next to it, if it wasn't for his quick thinking, dragging the refueling hoses, he made a loop around 5 to get away from that fire. We could have had a lot more death and destruction there. And we get asked the question a lot is, why didn't you bring the bodies home? You ever been around an inferno of a fire with a helicopter and a 130 blowing up with C4 and everything in them? It's pretty damn hot. Cooks off pretty damn good. You ain't going anywhere near that sucker for many, many hours. Next slide. So you see how the Hercs turned, it finished loading up and then left the village. Next slide. That's what it looks like real time the next day. The Iranians, we had to call them and tell them where the wreckage was. And the other helicopters blown up, we didn't do that. They did it. Make it look like they found it and was blowing it up while we was in operation. But no, they gave their fighters something with the helicopters. Next slide. Yeah, that's another photo of the Hercule. These are tough ones for me because I know whose bodies those are in there. Next slide. Yeah, pretty interesting. Next slide. These are graphic photos. They're more graphic in other photos that I won't go into how much it hurts my heart, especially this time of the year. Next slide. The other airplanes, once we loaded the people on, remember the bladders are empty now, so and they were full hurt. There was no problem with space or weight on the way out because they burned off gas and everything else. And oh, by the way, the good thing about the bladders is they did quite well for laying the ones that had burns. We had J.J. Byers, the radar operator on that airplane, had third-degree burns on his hands, both hands all the way up to his elbows. Had one of our fuel specialists was burnt, a couple of Delta guys. So and then the two helicopter pilots. See, on the helo, the 3 enlisted died. The 2 pilots were burned badly and were able to get out. So yeah, it's tough looking at the pictures, but I'm used to it. But with it being the anniversary tomorrow, it just makes it much more difficult. Next slide. Yeah. Next slide. That's who we lost. Rick Bakke, John Harvey, George Holmes, Dewey Johnson, Hal Lewis, Joe Mayo, Lynn McIntosh, and Charles McMillan. Joe Mayo is a great friend of mine. The night before we went in, we were sitting around a little fire pit we had there in Oman. So Joe and I were talking, and he goes, "Bakke, I don't think I'm coming back, man." He goes, "I just got a weird feeling about this." And he didn't. That haunts me to this day, that he had a premonition he wasn't coming back, and he didn't. Obviously, he knew something. Him and the Lord must have been talking. Next slide. After we got everybody on the airplanes and stuff, we sat down and we all almost collapsed because it was just so much. And about an hour or so later, I was walking from the airplane over to the tents, and the Brits came up that run that base, and they handed me 2 cases of beer that I took up to the tent that we drank that night. And on the bottom of one of the cases, which is now the motto of the 8th SOS and the 1st SOS, pretty much everybody that was part of that mission set can wear that motto. To you all, from us all, for having guts to try. So when you hear about the guts to try, that's where it came from. There's a book out written by Jim Kyle that really goes through training and everything else. It's called The Guts to Try. There's a documentary done by Mark Bowden, who did Black Hawk Down. It's called The Gets of the Ayatollah. It's a 4-hour documentary that goes through the state of Iran at that time, the taking of the hostages, the rescue mission, and then the afterlife of the hostages after. It's a great 4-hour book on the actual Discovery Times documentary. The book is great too, but the documentary is it's 4 hours worth. It's well worth it. And just so you know, there's a new one out. It won't be out until late summer. That Barbara Koppel, who was the director for Harlan County, USA. She won an Oscar for it. She is a well-known documentarian. She came to Hobart in 16 at our anniversary of Desert One, and I got roped into it along with a couple of others that she interviewed for a documentary she was doing. And it's called Desert One. And it premiered at the Toronto Film Festival. I had to fly up there in September of last year for the premiere because obviously I'm in it. Not that I wanted to be, but I was the one who was thrown to the wolves by them old crusty ass damn colonels. Give it to Taco, he'll do it. He remembers more about that than anybody does. Yeah, but I felt most of the pain. So it's an hour and 47 minutes. And I'm gonna tell you what, when it comes out, it's called Desert One. And I'll make sure Brian knows when it's physically released. And if I can get a CD for the schoolhouse out there, I will. But it covers, from the Iranian perspective, the interview with the Iranians. It covers Jimmy Carter is interviewed in it. Walter Mondale is interviewed into it. Tom Brokaw. It's got Delta interviewed. It's got Marines interviewed. Hostages interviewed in there. So it encompasses all pieces of that mission night and what led up to it, what was the aftermath and everything else. Now, I tell you ahead of time, it's tough for me to watch. And the reason being is those photos that you saw there of that charcoal airplanes, in that documentary, she's got the photos of the bodies that the Iranians portrayed to prove that Americans died. And I'm going to tell you what, when I'm looking at the remains of my brother's charcoal's remains, I don't take it too kindly. And she knew it was going to bother me, but I get through it. But she didn't show two, which was good, because I told her she had it. I probably had to shoot her myself. Because there are two other photos out there that very few people see, is where they're spitting and pissing on the bodies. But these photos are bad enough, trust you me. It's not for the faint of heart. Next slide. Operation Honey Badger, oh yeah. We went almost immediately into training for that after Desert One, and we did Honey Badger for almost 2 years. And out of that comes some of the greatest things when it comes to capability, techniques, interactions amongst services, everybody thinking with the same mindset, rehearsing with a full force and a full team there, not just anybody. So it's just a pretty good thing in Honey Badger. You know, I tell everybody, well, I have to live with the fact that tomorrow, 40 years ago, I failed the United States of America because my mission was to bring back 52 American hostages. That didn't happen, and we left 8 dead in the desert. Now, were there extenuating factors and everything else? Absolutely. But it was all said and done. We didn't execute the mission. Now, having said that, out of that, those ashes came the Phoenix. You look at what we have today in the United States military. U.S. SOCOM exists now. That didn't happen until 1987. 87. AFSOC came up in '89. All of the branches of service have a SOC department that's funded by US SOCOM. JSOC was brought up in 1982. So, I mean, we've done some great things. And then Congress has a Force Program 11, which you may or may not know about. Is a separate funding line within the military budget that goes strictly to South Forces funneled by through US SOCOM. So, I mean, it just, so if I look at it, the things of, it's just different, you know. Next slide. As you know, in anything, you go do something and you fail. Well, yeah, hey, you gotta have a commission to find out, well, who can we send to jail, fire, or whatever. And that's what the Holloway Commission was all about. It went into all the details and everything else, and it's got some very, very good findings. But the worst part is Colonel Kyle ended up being one of the casualties of that because the Air Force had to throw somebody under the bus, and he was the air mission commander, air component commander on the ground at the desert. Next slide. You know, they said, you know, when it was all said and done, the concept was great. It was consistent. Offered the best chances of everything. And success was about maintaining secrecy, and we did. I'm going to tell you we did. Because nobody knew nothing until after all shit hit the fan. Next slide. Command and control was an interesting thing. You know, SATCOM wasn't that great back then. It was brand new. So, you know, everybody had HF long wire antennas, and those don't go a long damn way. Nobody all was at the same place together. It was hodgepodge. Some of us didn't meet each other until we ended up at Alpha, which was in Wadi Kenya in Egypt. And some didn't meet each other until we were on the ground in Oman. So, and then some of us didn't even see each other until we were on the ground in the desert. So, you know, that's tough to pull pieces together like that. And even though the assault force was a small force, it had a bigger implication with the command and control. How do you do a full scale training exercise when you got that many moving parts in that many different parts in the world? Hard to do. But those were things, and they were right. But as I said, you got to remember the state of the military at that time. Nobody gave a hell about special ops. They didn't want us. Next slide. Adequate number of backups. I think we had the right number of backups, but you know, when you take those heaps off, you've compounded the issue. You know what I'm saying? The weather said it was, you know, once in a blue moon. But you know, that Habu was been brewing for about a day. So it just, the weather conditions, you know, that much sand on the desert floor. You're talking about 12 inches of loose sand. That's a tendency to ruin a whole damn airplane's day, I can tell you. My airplane that we flew in the desert, 640-565, out in the boneyard now. That airplane, we broke it pretty bad. When we got off of it at Oman, we never got back on that airplane. They flew a crew from Lockheed out of California to pick that airplane up. They got an air medal for flying it back to the States because we broke it so bad. The helicopter failure rate validity. I mean, it just, what can you do? That's why the MH-53s ended up at Hobart Field on 11 June 1980, was purely because of putting the helicopters with special capabilities, which were the Pablos, with the aviation software. I can tell you the AC-130 gunships that went to Guam in November and did all their long-range flying to shooting missions. I sure wish we'd have got tonight too, because they'd have lit up Tehran. I guarantee you right here now. And they were ready. Matter of fact, one of the airplanes was not going in, was not coming out of the desert. It was going to land at Manzuri and blow up in place, because it would have never had enough fuel, because it had to go to a north location to get back out, and nobody knew what was going on. They didn't have a tanker, so they had planned for that. Next slide. Busted weather forecast, for communication equipment. Well, I mean, you look at all these, and you'll see that they all end up in almost every one of them. The pilot aboard questions, the ones that went back because of the dust, that I questioned. The one on the BIM light and the hydraulics, no. Tactics restrictions, I still argue with that one until I die, because we had no restrictions. Problem is we were making the tactics as we were going. It wasn't something you could pull out of a book and say, let's apply this. You know, I mean, literally, all the capabilities, infill, exfill, night vision goggle landings, all those tactics and techniques, they are all developed during that planning and execution, and thereon. Those are all gospel today, and that's how they're done. You know, flight planning, we got there covertly. We got to Egypt and to Oman covertly. Maybe on the flight planning factors of between ops not telling Intel what they needed and Intel telling ops what they needed. I think the fact that the helicopters flew so low, should have flown higher. Those early warning radar sites hadn't been operational in almost 2 years. How they thought they were operational, I'll be damned if I know. Next slide. I guess we ain't got no slide, operator. There we go. At Arlington, there's that one monument that's got the 3 bodies in it. And the reason being is there wasn't enough of their remains to determine who they were. So that has been a tough one for the families that it's been hard for closure. You know what I mean? So I see one from Larry. Intel always used worst case for threat planning. I can tell you what, I love my Intel dogs, but sometimes I want to shoot you too, because in all my combat missions I flew after that, all the way up to including Noble Anvil when we were, or Allied Force when we were doing leaflet drops in Kosovo, you know, going into mission briefs and me having a TS, SCI, CITK, you know, I could know anything anybody wanted to know. But sometimes we didn't ask the right question, and I think sometimes because I was flying with young crews in the 7th at that time, to ask the right questions to get the right answer. Intel is more, and still in my mind somewhat, more protective of the source than the data. You know, don't want anybody to know where we got it from. Did we get it from a rivet joint or a satellite or a human? And that's the thing that kills us always. We don't have that much human capability out there anymore. You know what I'm saying? Not like we had during the Vietnam War and some other, but we really haven't had that much there. So, you know, ops, sometimes you got to love those young crew members. If you look at the average age of them, they're babies right now. And I know some of you Intel people are babies too. But the bottom line is to me, if you're going to go on a mission, both sides have the need to know everything. What are you planning? What are the tactics you're going to do as an operator in there? Okay. This is what I can tell you about what's out there from a threat or a possibility. I as an operator don't have no requirement to know where it came from. I could give a damn less. I just want to know, is it there? In the case of Kosovo, the gunship got lit up by a SA-6 the night before. They told us we were flying out of Mildenhall. They were flying out of Brindisi in Italy. Intel wouldn't confirm it. We can't confirm that. We haven't had it validated by a second source. And, at Mildenhall, we also had rivet joint there. Nobody told us. So we go fly and we get lit up. But, I mean, when you see a SA-6 come flying by the ass into your airplane, it gets your attention pretty damn quick. And we land, and I'm a chief master sergeant now, and me and Intel, all of them had a funny come to Jesus meeting after that one. We land and go, oh, we can confirm that that there was a site, an active site there. But no shit, I can confirm it too. I need to clean the shit out of my flight suit. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So any questions? Thank you, Jared. For me, it is good to talk about it every once in a while, but at the same time, I try to set some basic things straight about it, because over time, you're talking about 40 years, there's a lot of rumor, propaganda. I can tell you all this, that we weren't able to talk about anything for almost 11 years, and the reason being was that there was $1 million bounty put on everyone's head who was on the ground that night. It stayed classified for a long, long time. And in that time, I'd be out places drinking a beer or whatever, us guys, or while we were doing honey badger or other missions, and you'd be somewhere and you hear some talking head talking about how stupid the idiots were that flew the radar on our end, buffooneries and all the things that happened, the armchair quarterbacks, and you want to say something, you want to slap them in the damn head, but you can't, because you can't say nothing. And that was some trying time. You're talking about Credible Sport. Credible Sport was brought, and that was an airplane that was modified within 90 days to land in a soccer field and take off in a soccer field. First airplane is still buried at Field 1 because the retro rocket was fired early and it crashed. I was involved in it, but I didn't actually get to fly on one of the missions. There was only a few crew members, active duty people that actually got to fly. But yeah, we all know about it. It's a pretty interesting thing. The planning factors that necessitated the Desert One site straddling the roadway at all. The problem was there was no site that you could land airplanes on without bringing notice, meaning a runway and stuff of that nature. So we had to do it in a covert place. And C-130s are designed and can land in the desert. We've been doing that years on dirt surfaces and whatever. Helicopters could do that. So we just needed to find a remote place. So everything gravitated to the desert because of remoteness, the fact that a 130 could land there, helicopters could land there, and we could do refueling there all at the same time. So, we would have loved to have flown into downtown Tehran International at the dual gun. But by the time you got the airplanes in reverse, all of Tehran would have known and the hostages would have been killed. So it just it evolved to the landing site for those particular reasons. Anybody else? I can sit here and talk to you all day. It's raining here in Mississippi. I live down here in the SIP, Katrina land. The fighters, there was nobody wanted anything to do with fighters on night one. They raised too much of a radar signature, too much of a noise signature. Now on night two, I can tell you this. Remember, it was a 2-night operation. once Delta breached the wall in the embassy, all hell was going to break loose. The Nimitz was going to launch everything it had. There were some fighters in Egypt that were going to launch. There were some fighters in Saudi Arabia. There was fighters in Turkey. Oh, yeah, there were. See, like I said, it's a lot bigger than people realize. They weren't briefed on what their mission was. They were just staged. But on night two, Tehran, downtown Tehran and Tehran International put what it looked like a damn parking lot of bombs, because all hell was going to break loose. But not on night one. Night one, the whole purpose was clandestine, covert. Nobody knows we were there, so we can come back and do night two. We had, on our airplanes, we had chapped and flare, and there were some jamming, but I don't know exactly what systems the EWO had, but we had an EWO on our airplane. There's a whole EWO suite. Maybe Brian can talk better to some of the systems that were on the airplane. I know we had the chapped and flares. And I know we had jammers. I don't know what else. Now, we did use, for radar detection, we used fuzz busters. Put them in the front lower windows on the C-130 fuzz busters to pick up anything trying to paint us. Pretty crazy stuff.
The C-130 fleet had a LR-69 as well.
Say again?
The C-130 fleet had an ALR-69 RWOL.
Yeah, 69 and I forget. Now after that, we ended up with a whole lot of crazy stuff on them. I'll tell you what.
How much training did you actually get into for Honey Badger in terms of, did you actually get down to like, this is what the plan is going to be, and this is these are the aircraft and things like that, or was it just like an idea on paper?
What, for Honey Badger?
Yeah.
Honey Badger, we did a full-up planning and rehearsal the whole time around landing, going straight in damn Tehran International Airport, dual runways, and attacking with everything you could think of. We had 141s, we had MH6, we had helicopters, Little Bird 60s that were all going to be part of that. We had 141s, Sol-2 141s. That was a dual runway operation that was in the plan as an alternate so that we would come in the other way. Now, there were some covert airplanes that would come in that if you ever system called Elbow, that is still a very classified system, but if that was a system that was going to be used to help facilitate that. Yeah, there was a lot of rehearsals around the dual runway operation for that. Then, after the hostages were released, Honey Badger was more of a training, picking up different terrorist threats in the world and looking at possible ways of mission planning that so you could put it on the shelf if required. So we used those places as what we would practice against, like, there was, I don't know if you remember TW-847 in Beirut, and then, the Kelly Laurel, the Karachi in Pakistan, hijackings and stuff. We patterned stuff after those things so that, and then we created what was called the bullet package and the alert force, where we could launch anywhere within 4 hours with an assault force and pretty much execute almost everything we needed. That answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
Hey, Chief, Tex Odenbayer. Did you guys take any of the lessons learned from the Israeli raid on the airport in Entebbe going into either the first operation or Honey Badger?
The Entebbe raid, really, when you look at it, really didn't have any kind of a focus for where we were going because of how they did it and where they were executing. That was like a one-off thing that the Israelis really didn't give a damn if they hurt anybody or blew themselves up. They were just going to go do that. You got to remember, America, you know, we got to protect lives first. And if the risk is too high, we're not going. Where the Israelis, man said, we're going to go and we'll get our people and whatever it takes, it takes. You know, we don't have that that mentality in the military. Now, did we do some cross with them on some tactics and techniques that they used in some of their low-level flying and landings in ours over time with some exchanges? Yes, but specifically using that, no. Hey, I want to thank you guys for allowing me to, an old dog, to reminisce a little bit. Tomorrow will be an emotional day. I'll drink a few beers and cry a bit for my friends. But I want to tell you another piece of the story, and this is a paid political announcement. Out of that night, we made, if you see my shirt right here, it says the Special Operations Warrior Foundation. Out of that night, we made a promise in Oman after we came back that we would take care of every child of every one that was killed that night. And initially it was the Bull Simon Fund, now it's the Special Operations Warrior Foundation. And we provide an education for every special operator killed, starting with the original 17, a full ride through college to a bachelor's degree, in some cases a little further. But the kids don't pay for nothing. We pick them up within 30 days of their mom or dad being killed. And it doesn't make a difference if it's training, real world, in combat. You know, if you're on active duty at the time, matter of fact, if you saw in the paper where the firefighting C-130 in Australia crashed, flight engineer on that was still, he was on terminal leave, was an active duty E-8 in the AC-130U gunship at Harvard. We picked his kids up within 5 days of that accident. Educated over children, and we got 1,200 in Hopper because, as you know, special operators are dying. You know, we make up about 3% of the total force, but we carry 78% of the total casualties. So we pay for that education. A lot of people mistake it for the Wounded Warrior Foundation. Two different things. Special Ops Warrior Foundation has been around since 1980. Wounded Warriors only been around since 2004. So if you ever think to donate to a charity, it's a Navigator charity 4-star. Pretty much 95 to 96 cents to every dollar goes to kids. And you can easily find it. Just type in www, find it, and read the stories yourselves of the kids who, you know, all of a sudden, nobody didn't come home. So thank you, guys. Thank you, Brian, for having me. And y'all have a wonderful Air Force Day. And remember, I thank you. I love what you guys do. Thank you.
Hey, Taco, I wanted to extend my thanks to you on behalf of the squadron. We really appreciate this. I know I asked you on one of the hardest weeks to talk about Desert One. I appreciate you doing that. Also glad that we were able, in some small way, to commemorate the 40th anniversary, knowing that not going to be a lot of public events for this.
Oh no!
With a bunch of press this year.
I can't even go to Herbert to the stained glass window, man. That bothers me heavily. But I respect the wing commander's request. Told me to stay home. Damn it! And you know, chiefs don't take too kindly to that. But hey,
I got a chief, and then thank you everyone of the widows for participating. Thanks for the questions. I'm glad that the chief took over and turned this into something valuable. Took the sticks away from me. By the way, if you talk to Chief Sanchez again on your own, and he has stories of me, you're probably about 2% true. So just keep
Yeah,
that
I'm
in
gonna
your
pay the BS flag on that. If I'm telling they're 100% true, it's my story and I'm sticking to it.
All right. If no one has anything else, I think Major, are you still on? The operations officer of the squadron, he might have something you want to say as a parting thing.
Well, Chief, I think Criminal has already said it all. We really appreciate you taking the time for us and sharing your stories with us. We're incredibly grateful for the sacrifices that you've made and that your brothers and sisters in the special ops world have made on behalf of all of us. Thank you.
And thank you, sir. And, you know, I love what you guys are doing now. It's pretty awesome. So if you guys get a chance, if you need me to ask me any other stories, because as Brian can tell you, you know, between Desert One, Grenada, Panama, Desert Shield, Desert Storm, Provide Comfort, Bosnia, Kosovo, I got a few t-shirts, not counting all the ones in Liberia and Sierra Leone down in our fun Dakar land. Ryan and I spent time at. Like, you guys take care.